drivers, thank you. You guys are one of our first gatekeepers out in the community. You see the kids well before any of us do. And you know a lot and you hear a lot, so it's really good to have you all at this training. If you've done it before, that's great. This just reinforces it. If you're new, hope you pick up some good tips. You have some veterans in the transportation staff that can tell you, how they've handled things, and that's really important. For new ed techs, teachers, food service, we've got a little bit of everybody in this room. The state requires us to provide suicide awareness and prevention training on a regular basis. Today, that's what this training serves for you. There are sign-in sheets all across rows. If you've missed one, just before you leave today, if you please could sign it. We're trying something new this year for the transportation. Last year, you had a sign-off form that you saw. This year, we've actually put it online. I've had to up my learning curve in how to use Google Forms and work with Andy Wallace in technology to attach things. So I'm going to ask you to go online to the new website, spsd.org. There is a staff tab up in the top bar. If you pull on the staff tab, you'll see this whole list of drop downs, and you'll see the suicide in there, and it has a certification sheet. So teachers, ed tech's going to ask when you go back to the building to look at the website, drop it down, certify that it's there, and I think I'm getting all the notifications, sort of hope not, but we'll deal with it after that. So welcome. I'm going to introduce our two trainers. They are veterans here in the district. They do a great job with a topic that is not the easiest topic in the world, but one that we should all be aware of because it does impact us. I know last year at Lewiston Middle School, they had 2 suicides, unfortunately. And Wayne Fleet had a string of them in the past too. What we want to do is we aim to keep people safe, not only our kids, but the people that we work with. So it's important to know what the warning signs are, and it's important to help say to somebody else, let me go talk to someone about this. If you're uncomfortable talking directly to a person, there are a lot of other supports here in the district. So I'd like to introduce Lita and Kara, both at the high school, and they're great go-to people, and they're going to talk about this tough topic.
Thank you.
Thanks, ladies.
Thank you all for coming today. This is a hard topic to talk about, and both Kara and I are social workers in the district. It was back in 2013 that the state of Maine put the suicide prevention training into law. So everybody that works in a school system, in a school district, is required to take this training. And every district has to have at least 2 gatekeepers, and Kara and I are gatekeepers here, and there are a couple of other people in the district that are gatekeepers as well. So today we're going to talk about suicide prevention, and the idea here is to have you guys be open and learn the language around suicide and look for risk factors in kids that you come across. You guys will all have the ability to develop relationships with kids. You guys might be on the front lines, of knowing what's happening with a student, and be aware of some of the things that you should be looking out for if these concerns arise. So because this is a tough topic and not knowing each of you, there might be some point in the discussion that you feel like you need to take care of yourself and you need to step out. That's totally okay. We get that. The whole idea is for you to get some idea about suicide prevention, and that's it. If you need to take care of yourself, go for it. There is also a video on NAMI Maine that's much more dynamic than Kara and I are at talking about suicide. They kind of dig back and look at how this became a law. There are a couple of parents that advocated for this to happen and went to the legislature because they had kids that died by suicide in their families. So If you feel like a lot of this information, there's a lot of numbers, there's just a lot of language being thrown out at you, if there's something that becomes a blur today or you need to step out, there is that video on NAMI Maine that you might find helpful. And I'm going to do this on and off thing with glasses because I can't see anything anymore. So today we're going to cover beliefs about suicide, how to talk about suicide, facts, warning signs, risk factors, basic intervention skills to use with suicidal behavior, resources for help. We will not get into the aftermath of suicidal behavior. The basic idea is we want you to err on the side of safety. So fact or myth? The true or false statement. Most people show signs that they are thinking about suicide. You guys can kind of think about that. Most people show signs. People who die by suicide have often shared their thoughts. And talking or asking someone about suicide will not plant the idea and cause a suicide. So the first one, people who die by suicide have often shared their thoughts. They do. People who are contemplating, who are in a bad spot, will often put something out there. It might not be quite direct. They might say things like, you know, I just don't think I'll be around next year at this time. This thing is just really too hard for me to carry, so I might end it sometime, I don't know. They definitely put information out there, and sometimes you don't know until you look back and think, how is that what was going on? For people who've been affected by suicide, if you look back, there were definitely signs. Most people show signs that they are thinking about suicide. They do. Again, it comes with direct and indirect kinds of information. There might be, all of a sudden, there might be some hopelessness when they talk to you. They might be hopeless about the future. They might be hopeless about if they've just been fired from a job. You might pick up on some, I'll never get hired again. I'm just not good enough. Just the theme of hopelessness is definitely a sign that somebody is thinking about suicide. And the idea that talking or asking someone about suicide will not plant the idea and cause a suicide. People get nervous about talking to others about suicide. Oftentimes, if someone is thinking about suicide, they want somebody to say something. They want someone to say, are you okay? Are you thinking about hurting yourself? And you guys might not feel comfortable doing that. But if you come across a kid where you're kind of seeing some signs, you're kind of worried about that kid, head might be down and they're just not playing sports anymore, they're not doing the things that they have a love for anymore, there might be some hopelessness there, they might not be taking care of themselves like they used to, you see a change, definitely talk to someone. If you're not comfortable in having the conversation and saying, geez, I've noticed all these signs, I'm not sure what's going on, definitely reach out to a social worker, reach out to an assistant principal, guidance counselor, anyone that might have a relationship with that kid might be comfortable to do something about it. But rather than not do anything, you ought to do something. So language considerations. So I still have to watch myself when I talk about this, and if you watch the news or you hear about these rock stars that are dying by suicide, some of the language that's still being used today is, that person committed suicide. And there's been a shift in using that word committed. A person doesn't commit cancer. A person doesn't commit a heart attack. They die by those things. It's the same with suicide. It's there's something going on with the person mental health-wise, and they're not, committing this awful act. They're struggling in their life. They're just having a hard time. and they end up dying by suicide. They take their lives in their hands. The word committed in the past was a criminal kind of thing. You know, people who died by suicide, their deaths would be investigated and kind of looked at, and it was like there was a crime that had been committed. And so that's why that kind of language had been used. So language that we want you to think about is, you might have heard, you know, he succeeded at suicide. He succeeded at killing himself. Or someone has attempted suicide and people say that was a failed attempt. The word committed, and that person's, you know, it's just a cry for help. And instead, they're really pushing us to change some of that language, to use, you know, he died by suicide, it was a suicide attempt. So take a look at this. Numbers are big every year. 38,285 people die by suicide as compared to the 16,000, so that's double. When you look at the rates for Maine, Maine is 9 times higher than that. So in 2011, these are kind of dated numbers, we don't have updated information, but in 2011, there were 204 suicides in Maine and 21 homicides. So that's 9 times the amount of homicides that we have here in Maine. And these are just some more numbers and a graph. And if you know, some of the things that we talked about when we were in our training is, why are these numbers so much higher in Maine and in the Northeast than the rest of the United States? Well, if you think about Maine, and if any of you grew up in a small town where there was a mill, those places shut down, and they're kind of like the lifeline of where you're from. You know, everybody works there, or at least someone in your family or someone you know is connected to that spot. And when those places close down and people don't have jobs and morale in towns is just really bad, these kinds of things happen. So suicide in Maine, every 2 days someone in Maine dies by suicide. Every 2 weeks that person is a young person. The rates for suicide are much higher with younger people in Maine. They indicate under 25, and we'll get into that some more in a little bit. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for Maine youth ages 15 to 24. When you think about Maine, there's a lot of rural areas in Maine. I come from northern Maine, right on the Canadian border, Frenchville. There are a lot of small towns everywhere, and the thought is people just don't have access to the supports that they might, like here in South Portland or in Portland. It's just more remote, and they don't come across the same support for whatever issues that are going on. Of every 5 suicides, 4 are males. Females attempt suicide 3 times as often as males. So the difference there with males and with females is that men will often use, or boys will often use, a more lethal means of, you know, they decide to either hang themselves or use a gun. And in Maine, there are lots of hunting families and people that have guns in their homes, so people have access to very lethal means to harm themselves. Women are more likely to try to overdose, so to take a lot of medication and try to harm themselves that way, and oftentimes they don't end up dying. So it's estimated that there are 25 attempted suicide for each death by suicide. So when someone goes to the hospital and comes across the ER, if they don't get a bed, so someone has attempted suicide and ended up at the ER, and they don't get a bed, that's not even counted as an attempt at suicide. You have to get a bed. So we say there's 1 death for every 25 attempted suicides. Those 25 people got a bed. A lot of people don't even get a bed, so the numbers are really high. And here they've broken it down by age. So for kids under 25, there are 100 attempted suicide, and that's the 100 that got a bed, to the 1 death. And for folks 85 and over, again, that idea of Maine being so rural, people living in small towns, you know, kind of by themselves, not many people checking in on them. The rates are 4 to 1. And the idea is, you know, with older folks, they've kind of decided this is it. I really want to end my life, and that's why the rates are that high. So what to look for? So there are warning signs, there are risk factors, and there are protective factors. So they'll tell you that the warning signs, those are the things that you'll kind of catch on early. The earliest observable signs that indicate the risk of suicide for an individual in the near term, within minutes, hours, or days, those are the things that, you know, when you see a person, they've changed a whole lot. They might not be taking care of themselves, they might be isolating, might not have been out and about with people, they've pushed everybody kind of away, just not taking care of themselves, and it's kind of imminent, someone that just can't get themselves together. Certainly we evaluate kids here at school, we assess them and call in for, you know, the supports we need. When we feel that it is imminent, they often end up at the hospital and get another assessment there, and decisions are made to either hospitalize them or, in some cases, let them go. But this is, the warning signs are kind of telling you, you know, this person's in trouble right now. Risk factors, those are the more long-standing kinds of things. Things that have gone on in a person's life that might make them more susceptible to thinking or wanting to die by suicide. There might be some issues in the family that are stressful and hard. There might be a certain way that they grew up, or, you know, have been exposed to some kind of abuse that have just made them struggle for a while. And protective factors, those are the things that are good in that person's life. So if they have connections to teachers at school, if they have a supportive network at home, kids that are connected to activities out in the community, whether it's sports or they're part of the drama club or whatever it is, those are things that kind of connect you and kind of define, you know, how things are going for you in your life. And then we get into warning signs. Immediate risk. Someone who has said they're going to hurt themselves, someone looking for a means to hurt themselves, or someone talking or writing about their death or dying or about suicide. So sometimes we'll hear kids will come in and say, so-and-so said such and such on Facebook last night, I'm really worried about them. We call those kids in and have a discussion about what happened over Facebook last night and what's going on. And 10 times out of 10, we're having to call home because this stuff was put out there. Sometimes kids are serious and sometimes they're not, but every single time we have to take it seriously because you just never know. Someone looking for a means, we don't come across that too often, although kids definitely have the ability and sometimes have the means at home, and those are part of the discussion that we end up having. And sometimes, you know, a teacher will come down and say, this kid just wrote this essay, and I don't know, I'm kind of worried about this kid. Could be 2 o'clock in the afternoon that we get that kind of thing. And if the kid is no longer in school, we're calling home to find out that everything is okay and have a conversation with them and their parents to make sure that that person is going to be safe. So anything that you come across, you know, you guys are around kids, you hear them talking, whether it's somebody said something on Snapchat or someone sent me this picture of this kid with a knife or whatever. I mean, these are some of the things that we've heard about, you know. We just want to make sure that everybody's going to be safe, and so we check it out. We have a conversation with them, and if it's nothing, then it's nothing, but we still have to do that. So someone might talk verbally about suicide. There are kids that are pretty direct about it, and then there's language that's not so direct. So the direct stuff, you know, you might get an essay that says, I wish I were dead. I'm going to end it all. I'm going to kill myself. You have kids that, you know, I work with some difficult kids, and sometimes their go-to and their language is, you know, when they're unhappy with something, I'm going to kill myself. And so you really have to stop and have a conversation about that, about, you know, if you're not thinking that, you can't just use that language. That's not okay. And it certainly impacts other people in the room, you know, whether they've been in a situation or they've had someone die by suicide in their own families. It's a tough thing for kids to hear. Less direct stuff, I'm tired of it all, you'll be better off without me, what's the point of living? Sometimes girls and boys do that in relationships, you know, if you break up with me, I'm going to be nothing, it's not worth living. Those are definitely things that we want to investigate. And sometimes, you know, that person just doesn't know how to express themselves, and that's why they're using that language. But other times, they might mean something. Then we've got a warning signs mnemonic. So if you're coming across, this is ideation, so it's threatened or communicated, someone who's thinking about suicide. Someone is using substances. Purposelessness, no reasons for living, if they've put those kinds of thoughts out there. Some anxiety, agitation, insomnia. People who are feeling trapped, feeling like they have no way out. Someone who's feeling hopeless, withdrawing from things, family, society, being by themselves. You're noticing a lot of anger, some rage, which is just different for this person. Reckless behavior, driving really fast, doing crazy things in their cars. Mood, sudden changes in mood. So this is a kind of a thing to go through. Like if you're worried about this kid and you're going through this, is path warm? You kind of look at it and think, has this person kind of been thinking about this stuff? Are they using? Have I seen some hopelessness? If you're picking up on some of these things and you're worried about someone, talk to someone, you know. Know that if you're driving a bus and you see this kid who's kind of been happy and, you know, things have been going well for them, and then there's a sudden change and you're overhearing, you know, this person's using this, using some substances, and they just haven't quite been themselves, and you're just feeling that something might be going on for that person. You don't feel comfortable to have the conversation. Let somebody know about it. You can call an AP. You can call one of us if you're connected to us somehow. Just tell someone. So sometimes, and a lot of times, we come across kids that might need to have a conversation with one of us or a guidance counselor or folks out in the community about things that are going on. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to, you know, they're at imminent risk of dying by suicide, but they might need to have a conversation about it, and it's okay to do that. You're not going to plant ideas in their head, but it's good to kind of assess and see where they're at. So if we're picking up on hopelessness, if we're picking up on behavior that's just different for them, hearing language about how they just feel stuck, things aren't going to change, things aren't going to get better, you know, it's a reason to have a conversation and kind of point those guys in the right place. We have conversations with their folks, and we try to get some help on board so we can alleviate some of the stuff that is happening. Then we move on to risk factors for suicide, and I'll hand things over to Kara.
So we're about halfway through, just to kind of let you know, and we're moving on a little bit into some of, I don't think we'd say positive, but at least hopeful in terms of what you can do and how to intervene. So we're going to just finish up a few more of the concerns around the risk factors. And as Lita mentioned earlier, there are different type of risk factors, and there's no single one risk factor that will cause someone to have a suicide attempt, but all of these things sort of combined together can be concerning. So we'll break these down a little bit here in the next slide. So for a student that you may know that they may have a risk factor of either perpetuating conditions, that means something that's unchangeable. There may be a predisposing condition, that's something of serious concern, and precipitating conditions, that's something very acute. We don't have to go through every single one of these, but basically, you know, if you know about a child, it maybe some of you have been in the district long enough, or you've been in the community actually long enough, where you know of a family who's had some difficult situations. You know, maybe there is a family that you know that has a recent death, and it doesn't even have to be by suicide, but they've lost a beloved grandparent. Maybe you have known or have been told that there's been significant abuse with that child, and they haven't shown signs themselves of anything going on, but maybe as they kind of come into middle school, you're starting to see some signs. Acute factors are ones that we do really want to pay attention to. For some students, some kids, if it comes around to being an anniversary of a death, particularly if there's an anniversary of someone in their family who has died by suicide, those certain times can be more risky for that student to do something to harm themselves or others. So personal behavior, behavioral, again, things that maybe that student has no ability to have controlled, but there's been divorce, there's been major mental health issues in the family, and moving over into the acute section for that, maybe one of those events has just happened. So that can be a tipping point. Environmental and social, those are things like your sexual orientation, the child's sexual orientation, gender identity. We have quite a diverse community here in South Portland, but for some kids as they're coming of age, having awareness that maybe they're different, their families, their parents are different. Chronic and severe stress over time. And then over on the far end of environmental and social, what we talked about earlier, access to lethal means. Maybe they were knowing some of the other kids in the community. Kathy mentioned there were some students in Portland at Waynfleet School who died by suicide, and there were students in Lewiston. So there's always the concern of those sort of events being a tipping point for other students. So high-risk groups actually are working age men, highest between 35 and 59. So, you know, again, we're talking about kids mostly, but we're also talking about ourselves here. Active military and veterans, high-risk elders, the LGBTQ community, and those are kids that we are talking about and knowing more about what they're going through in our schools. And through gender identity, transgender, all of those students may be at higher risk. Just because they're identifying that way does not mean that they're more prone to actually have an attempt. It just means that their risk factors can go up in large part because at times they're not accepted by their peers or perhaps at home. So we need to just keep those students more on our radar as needed, and Native Americans. From the point of view of a person who is suicidal, so, you know, even for those of us working with some of these students, in our minds, we may think, you know, they're not at that crisis point. We don't really need to bring in a social worker. I just said, hey, are you okay today? And we hear that sometimes from well-intentioned staff, that she got her lunch and she just kept on going. I think she's probably fine. And you know, the conversations we have with staff about that is obviously it's for the sake of the student that that student be speaking with someone who can really do the full assessment, but it's also for all of you. And we have had staff go home and rethink that conversation and feel legitimate concern. And that's a heavy weight to bear. Even those of us who are doing these kinds of assessments, we never do them in isolation. We're all in a quad together, the social workers here at the high school. 14, 16 years, some of us have been here, and we are still checking in with each other about, so-and-so just said this, what do you think? And that has nothing to do with our expertise. It's about carrying the weight and making sure that we're doing what we really need to keep that child safe. So to keep that in mind, for the person who's talking about it, they've already reached that crisis point, even if they're not showing it. They may feel that their pain is unbearable. They are not able to really rationally consider other solutions, and their thinking is very much affected. And again, what Lita mentioned, depression is a serious mental health issue for many people, and it really can distort thinking, and there's a lot of research on that now. However, it's important to remember, even if a child is presenting this way, or someone you know is presenting this way, often ambivalence exists, meaning they might still be thinking there's a way out of this, but they're not articulating that. So that's where we're moving towards the intervention piece of this. They may communicate their distress in ways that maybe it's through anger, maybe it's through behaviors that are very uncommon for that student. And often there are invitations to help, but you may have to read between the lines of the student who's in front of you to always know what those are. You know, so if they are presenting, if the student is presenting with feelings of being desperate or angry, I know a lot of times in our day-to-day, we get frustrated by those kinds of behaviors. We're tired, or we've seen that similar behavior in a student. And it sometimes just is taking that extra couple of minutes to be mindful. Does this feel or seem or look maybe a little bit different? Or have these feelings been expressed by this student, or some of these behaviors repeatedly over the last couple of days or weeks? So that might be an inroad. You know, everyone has a bad day or even a bad couple of days, but when you're seeing kids, or maybe it's a colleague presenting in a way that is ongoing, that might be a place that you check in with that person or with that student. We covered some of these before, you know, but if there are some thoughts that are actually shared around, I can't take this anymore, I can't do anything right, those sort of statements. And of course, the physical. Sometimes in high school and in middle school, you know, we might notice that a student's going through puberty or just, you know, changing in their physical appearance, but sometimes it's evidence that there's something else going on, particularly if there's loss of weight, or if they start to look, you know, like they've kind of lost some of their hygiene efforts or not sleeping as well. So those are signs to check in. So we mentioned briefly protective factors, and these are the positive qualities that we all have within us, and even those students, those kids who we are really worried about, everyone has protective factors. Sometimes that's our job, is to discover those. Maybe their parents aren't in a place to really note those. But we can tune in, and we can help students around their skills to think and communicate what they might need. We can validate their purpose and their value. You're really important here in this school community. I love seeing your face every day. You brighten my face, you know, when you come through the lunch line. I know that, again, we're talking about a lot of the people like the bus drivers and our cafeteria staff, but you are often, and our ed techs too, are the one-on-ones with these kids. Who get that everyday face time. So you might be in that place of just giving that genuine smile and noticing when they haven't been there and validating their purpose. Helping students around their own personal characteristics, their health, their positive outlook, and their healthy choices, calling on their supports, and making sure that their environment is as safe as it can be. So, how to help and why people sometimes hesitate to help. And you can see these up here, but just to go through them very quickly. Again, well-intentioned Adults will sometimes say, I thought someone else was going to do it, or I didn't want to admit. Oh, excuse me, I'm talking about staff. This is why a student may hesitate to ask for help. They may just have some of their own inhibitions around that, or they don't know what to expect if they were to ask. A lot of students in high school, really, no surprise, they worry that we're going to call home. And the reality is we do call home. And we try to do that in a very compassionate way. We try to do it with that student in the room. But that in and of itself can be a trigger. Sometimes we'll have students say, if you call home, then I'm really going to be in a place of wanting to hurt myself. So then we can feel in that push-pull situation, which is really, really hard. And that's when we call in other support staff to help with that. Sometimes kids just really don't want to upset the people they love, their parents, their siblings, by telling the truth of how badly they're feeling. So these are some reasons why people might not ask for help. This is what I had jumped to, why people hesitate to actually help. That's where we as staff sometimes worry we might say or do the wrong thing. The bystander effect is often a common one. Oh, I'm pretty sure they saw their social worker today. Or I think they were talking to the assistant principal earlier, and I'm sure that they shared that information there. Or I know the parent knows that that student has been cutting themselves for quite a while. Always assume that is not the case. Assume that you may be the first and maybe even the only person who's picked up on some of these signs. And no matter what your role is in the school that you're working for, your position is absolutely adequate and very important in the lives of the kids who you come into contact with. So please don't ever underestimate that role. A couple of things that are not helpful. Obvious ones, ignoring or dismissing. And you know, we say it's obvious, but even again, those of us who work with some really challenging kids, it can be, you know, it can be behaviors that are just difficult, and maybe we're feeling like we don't want to be dealing with this situation or with this student right now. So it's easy to dismiss what's happening. It's not easy, but it happens. It's also not helpful to act really shocked or embarrassed or explicitly uncomfortable. It's okay to feel those things, but if you show that to a child who's struggling, they may there, again, shut down. So trying to do your own self-care around these kinds of situations as they're arising and asking for support if you need it as well. Challenging or debating, you know, sometimes we hear things like, you really don't mean that, or you're fine, you're fine. Trying to avoid saying those kinds of statements is really important. So these are some things that are helpful. You're being genuine, listening carefully. I'm really concerned about you. Asking the question, that can be very hard. Are you feeling suicidal? Are you having thoughts of hurting yourself? And then, of course, if they answer in the affirmative to any of these sort of things, to never leave that student alone, not even for a few minutes. If they say they need to go to the restroom, then you get a staff person to come with you and someone goes into the restroom. If you need to find a male staff to do that, if it's a male student, you do whatever it is you might need to do. So this is a handout that Lita is passing around, and it might be useful for you to just keep on hand. And really what it's asking you to do is to put yourself in this situation. And that's a hard thing to do, but the reality is that will help you in preparation to put yourself in the situation where a student has come to you. And if you're in the elementary school, they're going to present probably a lot differently than in high school. But you know, what might one of the students that you are concerned about say or do? And what are the ways that you might ask the difficult question? Again, think of the developmental age group of the students you're working with. Might you need to say it in a little bit of a different terminology for an elementary school student? But how would you say it? And then to list 2 ways you would try to help and 2 resources in your own school. And so you can just take a few minutes and reflect on that and think about that. And, you know, when we're finished here today, if you have questions for either of Lita or me or Kathy about protocol or situations in your own school, you can definitely do that so that you can use that piece of paper as a resource. And before we go to resources, one other thing to just mention too, when I talk to high school students here about really trying to understand what is going on for themselves or others that they may be concerned about, we always talk about your internal radar. And all of us in the room, it doesn't matter how old we are, we all have that radar, that sense of knowing, you know, sometimes if you know, you might feel, I feel like one of my kids at home is like coming upstairs while I'm trying to have a private conversation. You know, you just sort of have that radar, like I sense something is there, or something's going on. Your radar around a kid that you know well is sometimes your best guide if they're not being explicit. So pay attention to that. If you have a vibe that something is off with one of your students, someone you care about, just really tune into that. You may be off. Maybe they didn't eat that day, but whatever it may be, you can attune to that person. And if nothing else, ask someone else to do that too. So paying attention to your radar. Resources for help. These are ones that you may already know about, but of course, if it's imminent, as Lita said, we use our school resource officers and we call 911 if we need to, if someone's really in imminent harm. We have a statewide crisis hotline that's available for everyone to use. I often give out the 774 help number, and I don't know if people are familiar with that. If you're from out of state, it's an easy one to remember. It's 774 help. And just to put it out there, you don't have to be in imminent crisis to use that number. We encourage parents to call that number if they are at home or over a break and they're just worried about their son or daughter and they're not really sure how to respond. And as teaching staff, support staff, we access the 774 helpline a lot. What do you think? Can I present this situation to you? Do we need to have this person, this child, go into the ER today? We really use them as the skilled professionals, even over the phone, and they will come and do full assessments at the hospital or at the school or at home if needed. And that's our local crisis agency. You know, nobody likes to go to the ER. People who've been there for a variety of reasons know that you may be sitting there for hours, so we try to avoid sending kids straight to the ER, but sometimes that has to happen. And just connecting with whoever their support team may be. And I really did just mention that. They're 24/7. That's the 888 number, but we also have the 774 help number. The phone consult is invaluable. If you're ever in a situation where you're not able to get another colleague to, you know, discuss this with, or you're home, call a 774 help number and present the situation to them. Kids can call that as well. So this is where I'm going to refer you back to your own buildings, that you do have a conversation with your building principal, guidance counselor, or whoever it may be, that you do find out what your protocol is in your building. We go through that here at the high school, and it usually involves our school resource officer. Sometimes it involves our school nurse, and it always involves an administrator. So probably that's similar for each of you as well, but just that you make sure that you know about that. And that's pretty much the conclusion of our presentation. As Lita said, this is difficult information to take in. It's hard to sit with, particularly if you've been affected personally or in any way, or if any of the students that you've worked with either in this district or another district, you may be calling them to mind as you're sitting here. And we know this is hard. So when these situations come up, we just really do encourage you to take care of yourselves while taking care of the student in front of you. Most important thing to take home, ask for support and don't wait. Don't wait till you've gone home and you've sat on it for a while. If there's any concern whatsoever, please pull in someone else who can help you discuss the best course of action. But if there are any questions, Lita and I will be here, and Kathy's still here as well. So if you'd like to come up individually, or if there's questions for the group, something maybe we didn't cover, or any clarifying questions, we can take those now. Yes.
How does the opioid epidemic fall into the suicide prevention program? Are those numbers, how would they skew to?
I think that's a really good question. We don't have recent data on that. And I don't know if they differentiate between accidental overdose, intentional overdose. You know, I think it's a very timely question that we don't have a lot of the answers to. We do know, it's particularly in the high school level, when students that we're working with, even if it's not using opioids, but if they're using drugs on a regular basis, their risk factors are continuing to escalate. We just know that to be true. But I think we'll find out a lot more around statistics and research as this crisis unfolds, especially in our state. Yeah, I do.
I have a question as a parent of young kids and as someone working in one of our elementary schools in the district. Not that this would be my goal necessarily,
Yeah.
but what age is it appropriate to be talking to kids about being aware of some of these warning signs in
Yeah, that's a,
and like what language is appropriate for us to use? Obviously, we can
yeah.
talk to kids one-on-one about feelings, but in terms of sort of or what we say in school.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I don't feel, I'm not as much of an expert in the elementary school, but I know that my kids went to small, and I know that their guidance counselor, Kurt, you know, he would come into every classroom and talk about, he wasn't calling it suicide prevention per se, but when to let someone know that you're concerned about your friend, you know. And whenever, I think it's never too early to talk about, with kids about, as you said, feelings and how you manage those feelings. So, you know, kids start to hurt themselves, whether it's intentional or unintentional, at early ages, and really clarifying. There used to be that myth, we talk about it here at the high school, that if you were a cutter, that was considered just that you were being someone who's really dramatic. The old term was you're being emo, emotional, you know, and now we know there's actually research that someone who cuts is at higher risk for suicide. So that, I guess, you know, to answer that, even some of the minor behaviors that kids might be showing around self-harm or talk would be taken seriously even at a young age. Yeah. Yes. Oh.